Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to invite you, or to greet you here at the IISS. My name is Dr. Andrew Chi, the editor of the Armed Conflict Database and a research fellow here at the Conflict Security and Development Programme. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this month's instalment of Conflict Briefings. We have this every month, and on this month we'll be focusing on Mali. To my left, we have Virginia Comolli, who is a senior research fellow here at the Conflict and Security Development Programme, and also the head of the programme as well. She's also a West African analyst or expert as well, and has written books on Boko Haram. On my right, we have Flore Berger, who is an assistant research analyst who focuses on sub-Saharan Africa and monitors and examines security and political and humanitarian developments in the West Africa context as well. This afternoon's event will be on the record. And before we start, may I just ask that you could please switch off your phones or put them on silent, and then we can begin. Just wait for people to settle. Brilliant. So, Fleur, let's start with you. Tell us what's going on in Mali.
Yeah. So, in the past few months, violence and insecurity in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger have reached levels never experienced before in the region. This is due to a combination of jihadist and communal violence. None of those phenomena are new, but the scale of the violence is. So we record these attacks in the armed conflict database, and what you see behind you are all the armed clashes and violent incidents that we recorded since January 2018, as well as human security and civil unrest incidents. So as I said, it's a combination between jihadist and communal violence. If we start with jihadist groups, jihadist violence, the recent trends show that the attacks are more complex, more frequent, and distributed across the whole region of central Mali, north and east Burkina Faso, and western Niger. But we also see that these attacks are deadlier. So we recorded the two deadliest attacks against military positions since 2017. The first one happened in March and was conducted by the Al-Qaeda coalition called Group to Support Islam and Muslims, and they killed 26 soldiers in Mopti, which is the central region of Mali. The second attack happened in May in western Niger this time and was conducted by the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. They ambushed a patrol and killed 28 soldiers. What is also worrying is the communal violence, so the second side of the violence. This is fueled by jihadist attacks. And for a quick comparison, just to understand the scale of the violence, last year around 300 civilians were killed in over 100 incidents. This year, if we just take the three deadliest attacks, we're already over 300 killed. The deadliest one happened in March, where 157 Fulani were killed. So the scale is different, but the nature of these attacks also is. The aim is not anymore just to kill young herders to steal their cattle or to prevent them from joining jihadist groups. Now, attackers are erasing entire villages overnight. They're killing women, men, and young children alike. So here the purpose is really to terrorize the Fulani, which they accuse of allying with the jihadists, and forcing them to leave the area. So we'll go back later during the conversation on who are those groups, where they operate, and who are those militias, but for now what matters is to remember that the violence is much higher than it has ever been in the Sahel.
But how did we get here? If we were to examine, or in your view, how did we get to this point that we are now?
Yeah, so to understand what's going on now, we need to go back to at least 2012. So I'm going to give a short summary of the events between 2012 and now. So in January 2012, the Tuaregs in northern Mali rebelled against the Malian state and took up arms to establish an independent state in the north. They were backed by Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda, Ansar Din, and a splinter group of Al-Qaeda, which is called Mujahid. So the Tuaregs and the Islamist groups allied and managed to take Kida, Gao, and Timbuktu, the three main cities in the north, in 3 consecutive days. They then called off the offensive because their goal was achieved, and they proclaimed the independence of northern Mali, which they called the Azawad. But the cooperation between the Tuareg rebels and the jihadist group did not last. They could not reconcile their conflicting views when the jihadist group started to impose Sharia law in the Azawad. So they started to fight against each other, and the Tuaregs were chased out of the territories they had conquered with the jihadist group just a few months before. Then the jihadist group occupied the north for about 6 months, and they started to ally and push down towards Bamako, the capital, and this prompted the French intervention. So in January 2013, the French launched Opération Serval, and within a month, the jihadist groups were ousted from the territories they controlled, or at least the main cities they controlled. The fighting did not stop. There were still clashes between jihadist groups and Tuareg rebels, between Tuareg rebels and the different groups, and also between jihadists and French and Malian forces. A lot has happened in between, but the next event is May 2015, with the signing of the peace agreement between the Malian government, pro-government groups, and Tuareg rebels. The implementation of this agreement is still ongoing and has created a lot of frustration in international partners, because still a lot has to be done, and generally it has been very slow, and little progress has been made over the past 4 years. But what is more interesting for us is that while the Tuaregs were negotiating with the government, the jihadist groups that were chased out by the French did not disappear. They just dispersed, reorganized, and spread. And we can distinguish 3 phases in the spread of jihadism militancy in the Sahel. The first one, in 2015, when the groups moved from northern Mali to central Mali. The second phase in late 2016, when the groups spread across borders and established bases in western Niger and northern Burkina Faso. And the last phase, which is the one we're currently in, started about a year and a half ago, so beginning of 2018, when the group spread to eastern Burkina Faso and started to establish bases there. So yeah, that's a very short story of how we got here today.
Brilliant. Virginia, over to you. Fleur has mentioned about different armed groups, or a few of the armed groups. Can you just tell us about the armed groups that are operating, where they're operating, and sort of what is the sort of tactics or information about them?
Sure. As you said, as Flore pointed out, the region has long been characterized by a wide array of armed groups. And jihadists are the key protagonists, but not the only ones, but the key protagonists of the violence across the region. I think this map is really helpful to show people where the different groups operate. But there are 2 main groupings. One that Flore has already mentioned is normally referred to by its acronym. JNIM is the group for the support of Muslims and Islam. It's basically is a group that emerged following the merger of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, Ansar al-Din, An-Nur Abitud, and the Masina Liberation Front back in 2017. One thing that I should say is that the region has long been a stronghold for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and the many splinter groups and offshoots that have come from it. So it is a region where, for groups that are not aligned with AQIM, it is quite hard to establish a very strong hold. As you can see, different elements within JNIM are present across different parts of Mali, but also spreading into Niger and into Burkina Faso. We estimate that between 1,000 and 2,000 fighters make up this JNIM coalition. In terms of their preferred targets, they tend to aim at security forces, both national and international. MINUSMA, the United Nations Stabilization Force mission, faces its greatest challenge. Well, the UN faces its greatest challenge in Mali as this is the deadliest destination for UN peacekeepers. What is also interesting to note, and I think this is a reflection of this desire to align with broader Al-Qaeda decision to focus on targeting security forces and reducing the targeting of civilians, also to distance itself or differentiate from Islamic states that is infamous for its more indiscriminate targeting. I would say one thing about naming of all these groups, and I promise this is not just a boring point about labels. I refer to some of these groups with their, I would say, older names. And oftentimes when you read reports now, you don't hear about the Masina Liberation Front, but you read about Katiba Masina. Katiba, it means brigade. And there are a number of semi-autonomous brigades, such as Katiba Serma or Katiba Al-Mansur, that are active across Mali. Why I'm saying this is important is because this division into brigades represents the more localized nature of these smaller groupings. And this is very important because it speaks to the resilience of the JNIM insurgency as a whole, and also speaks to this convergence of the transnational jihadi movements and ideologies and agendas with the more localized grievances that may drive radicalization and then also violence. So that is quite important to keep in mind. The other grouping that is being driving the violence is the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which emerged in 2015 when some former Mujao and Murabitun members pledged their allegiance to al-Baghdadi. It's primarily active across the tri-border area of Burkina, Mali, and Niger. It doesn't shy away from attacking civilians. And the other thing that is also worth noting with regard to Islamic State is in the Greater Sahara is that up until more or less this year, Islamic State in the Middle East has paid limited attention to what was happening in its Sahelian province. But things have started to change, and there have been videos released this year where Sahelian jihadis belonging to Islamic State have been praised for their bravery. What also I would think is noticeable is that unlike other regions where there is a clear rivalry between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State provinces, here in the Sahel this relationship is much more nuanced and fluid. Of course, in some occasions there are tensions and rivalries, but there are also instances of tolerance, but even of coordination and collaboration when it comes to launching attacks. The final group that I want to mention, and this really relates very much to the spread into Burkina Faso that Fleur has already alluded to, and that is Ansarul Islam. This is a group that originated in the northern part of Burkina Faso and in the Soum province, and it was firstly acknowledged in 2016. And what is very interesting about this group is that it's a very clear example of how those homegrown dynamics, indeed international jihadism trends, come together. The group is very much rooted into local grievances in terms of the economic, political, and ethnic marginalization that the people of northern Burkina Faso are suffering. There are, but also benefits. This balance benefits from spillover from Mali, and the fact that the original leader Ed himself had ties with Malian jihadi, and also more recently with Islamic State. So again, this is the other key actor that on the jihadist spectrum is currently active in the region.
Fleur mentions the sort of rise of jihadist groups versus the sort of communal violence in the first year of 2018, this year and also 2018. what are we to understand about this rise and the differences between these sort of use or the use of violence by both sort of sectors or areas?
Yeah, well, this is where things get quite complicated. There are, of course, lots of different ethnic groups and with different faiths and speak different languages and different traditions. And what we've seen, especially in the first part of this year, is an increase in communal violence, as you mentioned, especially in central Mali. And this is really the result of a convergence of the rise in jihadism that we've seen in recent years with communal tensions and communal violence that stem from ethnic divisions and also competition over natural resources. I'll try to explain it in as clear a way as possible, but first let me just lay down the different pieces of the jigsaw. As we said, we've seen a rise in jihadi activities and in jihadi groups in recent years, which have prompted the emergence of a number of self-defense militia in Mali that are aimed at fighting these jihadi groups. These self-defense militia, they tend to belong to the Dogon ethnic group. They didn't come out of nowhere. They usually first existed as hunters organizations, and then in recent years they decided to take up arms against Jnim and other jihadis. So this is one element of the story. The other element of the story has to do with the Fulani. The Fulani is a semi-nomadic or nomadic ethnic group that lives across multiple countries in the Sahel, and the Fulanis are also the largest cattle owners across the entire region. We've seen tensions involving the Fulanis in a number of countries, in Mali, in Nigeria, where those tensions now amount to fully fledged conflict, in Central African Republic, elsewhere. Those tensions arise when those cattle herders, as a result of climate change, oftentimes, and desertification, are forced to move in search for water and grazing land. And in those areas, they clash with the existing community, or usually farmers' community. So this type of tensions also existed in Mali for a long time. So what is happening now is that there has been a stigmatization of the Fulani groups. Oftentimes they are accused by some of these self-defense militia, but also by government forces, and that's a problem in its own right, to be jihadis. And of course, this is a massive generalization and a factual error. But there is some truth in saying that some of these jihadi groups sometimes recruit from within the Fulani community. So, to cut a very long story short, we've seen an increase of attacks on the part of this Dogon self-defense militia against Fulanis. The most violent of these attacks happened in March, when nearly 160 Fulanis were killed in the Mopti region. There was an international outrage. The UN and International Criminal Court of Justice sent observers to investigate what had happened. The Malian government has ordered that one of these militia was disbanded, and military chiefs were also removed. However, I am a bit skeptical about the prospect for reducing this violence, because what we've seen is the continuous stigmatization of the Fulanis, which has led to a very vicious cycle of retaliatory violence. We have already seen Dogon villages being attacked on purpose by Fulanis in retaliation for previous violence. And we've seen constantly the Malian authorities and also a number of the signatory groups to the Malian Peace Accord that have been themselves either attacking or kind of allowing attacks against the Fulani. So which is likely to lead to further radicalization within the Fulani community. So it's a very bleak picture, I'm afraid, and it does require, I would say, a more serious approach on the part of the Malian government.
Thank you very much. Flo, back over to you, and let's focus a little bit on the humanitarian context. What has been taking place? How has the conflict impacted that? Is it working? Isn't it working? Just bring us up to speed.
Well, as you can imagine, the humanitarian situation is degrading every day as the violence and insecurity continue to escalate. I'll focus only on the internally displaced people, the IDPs, and access to education, but of course much more could be said about access to food or access to health services. So if we start with the IDPs, of course they have sharply increased. And in Mali, we see that the number has tripled between January 2018 and January 2019. So as you see, it went from 40,000 to 120,000. Almost half of those IDPs are in the Mopti region, the central region of Mali. And if we just take one attack, the one Virginia just talked about in March, where 157 Fulani were killed, just after this attack, 3,000 people were internally displaced. If we look now at Burkina Faso, these numbers are even more staggering. It went from 8,000 in January 2018 to 170,000 today. And you see the particularly sharp rise from the beginning of this year, so from January 2019. Over the past 6 months, it means that 1,000 people have been displaced every day in Burkina Faso. Most of them are in Soum province, which is in the Sahel region, so bordering Mali. In the past 2-3 weeks, we've also seen for the first time people are starting to flee from northern regions and reaching all the way south to the capital, Ouagadougou. And that's the first time we see this type of movements. It's also the first time since independence that Burkina Faso has lost control over part of its territory and that the country faces such massive displacement. So that's for the IDP now. If we go to access to education, we know that more than 2,000 schools have been closed in the past year due to insecurity. And this is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. This means that around 500,000 children are not going to school. And again, Burkina Faso is hit particularly hard with 1,000 schools closed over the past year. So just 2 points to go beyond these numbers. First, if it continues, this is going to have a lasting effect on a whole generation. Because when children miss out on school, especially in time of conflicts, not only are they unable to acquire the skills they need to develop themselves and their communities, but they also become vulnerable to different types of exploitation, including sexual abuse and forced recruitment in armed groups. The second point is that there is no doubt that schools are closing because of insecurity. It's quite clear schools have been targets of attacks by jihadist groups, teachers are being threatened by these groups, parents don't dare to send their kids to school anymore because they're not sure if they're going to come back. And entire villages have been, people have left entire villages, so the school is just empty. There's no one to go to school anymore. But it is also due to pre-existing and chronic shortfalls in the education system. In Mopti, for example, the region most affected by violence, 5 strikes have been organized by teachers since the beginning of the school year, so September 2018. And so the point here is that it's important to remember that the current security crisis is taking place in an environment where there are already structural issues and lack of infrastructure. And so we see really here like the catastrophic combination and how difficult it becomes to deliver services when we have a general lack of infrastructure and a security and crisis that is so big and as we know it since the beginning of the year.
A question for both of you, given what you've spoken about, particularly on the sort of French peacekeeping operations and the sort of UN operations, what solutions have been put in place? And I guess my question is, how effective have they been? Clearly not effective, but why haven't they worked or worked to a degree?
So I'll start with the national answers and I'll let Virginia talk about the international side. So to answer your question and talk about effectiveness or not, I'll just make 5 observations that apply to all 3 countries and that affect conflict dynamics across the whole region. The first one is that military personnel and military operations are not adapted to the fight against very mobile and resilient groups which use guerrilla tactics to conduct their fights. The soldiers are not well trained and they're not well equipped. Another issue is that the military bases are often in cities, and so troops are deployed in border areas, along dangerous roads, or in rural areas for a specific operation, sometimes for a few days, but it's always temporary. So they manage to get a few victory against jihadist groups, destroy a hideout or take over some villages, but when they leave, the jihadists come back and they can move freely again. The second point is that, which is linked with what I just said, is that all three countries cooperate and sometimes completely rely on local groups and self-defense militias to conduct counter-terrorism operations. And this is what Virginia talked about. So they rely on these groups because they have what the traditional military forces do not. They know the terrain really well, and they have a sustained presence in rural areas. But of course, this comes with consequences, and as Virginia said, it has fueled communal violence and undermined state legitimacy, because they have started to target a specific community, the Fulani, which they accuse of allying with jihadist groups. And what doesn't help is that the armed forces themselves have been accused of extrajudicial killings of Fulani during counterterrorism operations. The third point is that while I was researching for this presentation, I really struggled to find an articulated and in-depth counterterrorism or counterinsurgency strategy coming from these countries. And I also struggled to find a proper framework of cooperation. It doesn't mean that nothing has been done. That's not what I mean to say, but they have launched plans, both on the security side, to reinforce their military personnel or to create new, more mobile counterterrorism divisions, and also on the development side. So they've tried to foster, to create more economic opportunities, but still, it seems like a coordinated and a coherent strategy is still lacking. The fourth point is that while all actors involved have acknowledged that a military answer alone will not resolve the crisis or the conflict, not enough efforts have been put into addressing the local roots of the conflict, and by this I mean engaging with local leaders into local dialogues, addressing the needs of the pastoralists, opening line of communication with militants, reinforcing rule of law institutions, and mostly engaging in a serious reform of the security sector. Of course, I understand that all of this is difficult to put in place, especially in such a volatile environment, and that it's not going to happen overnight. But still, the military option and short-term wins are often prioritized over long-term development strategies and political dialogue. The last point before I give the floor to Virginia, and is linked with what she's going to talk, is that Mali, well, these countries, but particularly Mali, rely extensively on international partners to provide security. And what it means for the Malian authorities is that their own strategies are heavily influenced by the one of their main partners, which are their main donors. This is France and the EU, and their priority is to curb migration and the illicit drug and trade trafficking in the region. So relying so much on others doesn't help Mali to develop and implement its own long-term strategy to address the root causes of the conflict.
Looking at the international dimension, given the number of challenges from the conflict, insurgency, jihadism, the criminal elements that Flore just referred to, it's no surprise that in recent years a number of international actors have actually become involved in the Sahel, and you can say the region has been highly securitized, which in itself is a rather contentious statement, because, for instance, we ran a panel on security in the Sahel at the Munich Security Conference this year, and actually that was a very contentious point, because there were some experts and officials on the panel who were arguing that the region has been overly securitized at the expense of other things, other approaches, the non-security ones, whilst there were some, especially from within the region, officials from the region, who were arguing the region requires even further securitization. So this, of course, is something that we could debate at length, but let me really talk about all the key international actors here. Of course, the French play a key role. Following Operation Serval, we had the establishment of Operation Barkhane in 2014, which is a region-wide counter-terrorism operation which features about 4,500 soldiers. And it's not only based in Mali, but also has presence in Burkina Faso, Niger, and in Chad. This operation is France's largest overseas operation, with a large budget of 600 million euros per year, and has also seen an increased expansion into Burkina Faso in response to the growing insecurity that we saw there. Foreign Minister Le Drian was in Burkina in October, where he announced a $34 million tri-border aid package to really address the root causes of radicalization and insecurity. And interestingly, Burkina Faso, which is a country that has long been reluctant to ask France for military help, has called on French friends to intervene and to launch operations last year, and we saw some this year as well. The other key actor in the region, as we've already mentioned, is MINUSMA, is the United Nations. The current mandate is due to expire at the end of this month, and there have already been multiple calls, including on the part of France and many other international actors, to extend the mandate. As I already mentioned, MINUSMA peacekeepers have been attacked regularly. And there are also some caveats, I'd say, regarding the conduct of the operations that have been limiting the effectiveness of MINUSMA peacekeepers. And this is particularly when it pertains European contingents within MINUSMA. Their ability to do things is very much reduced. In fact, if you look at the number of MINUSMA peacekeepers who have been killed, the vast majority is from a non-Western contingent. But MINUSMA is one of the guarantor of the Algiers peace accord, and although it doesn't have now a very kind of specific counter-terrorism mandate, as I said, there is a call for extending its mandate and also to give MINUSMA much more aggressive one. And this calls became even louder following the incident in March, where nearly 160 Fulani were killed, which we've already mentioned repeatedly. So Barkhane and MINUSMA are aimed to complement themselves. And now there is also a new actor, relatively new actor, represented by the joint force of the G5 Sahel country, so Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, which came into being in 2017 with an approximately strength of 5,000 troops. It does rely a lot on external support and funding, which is one of the weaknesses that already has been highlighted by Fleur. And President Macron and France in general have been very supportive of the G5 Sahel, and I think this is also in the hope that if this new actor can take more responsibility and a bigger role, France could afford to limit its own commitments. I have to say, given how the G5 Sahel force is performing, I don't see that happening at any point soon. But anyway, the focus, geographically speaking, the focus of the G5 Sahel force is really on border areas. And again, targeting the targeting of G5 Sahel forces by jihadists, shortages, like budget shortages, and sometimes mistrust among the different contingents that make up G5 Sahel force are among the challenges that the force is facing. Briefly, other key actors that we know are active in the region on a security side are the United States. The United States has been involved in the Sahel from post 9/11 onwards in different capacities, and it also runs the annual regional flintlock military exercise that involves multiple contingents from African and European and North American actors. It is also supporting French and UN missions across the region, and also been providing training for local troops. There was an interesting shift in November last year where the American administration announced that troops deployed with AFRICOM, the US African Command, would see a 10% withdrawal over a 3-year period, which would basically translate into a reduction of 700 troops that were deployed in counter-terrorism roles in Mali, Cameroon, and Kenya. I think this is very much a symptom of the US administration's desire to refocus its attention to other regions and other challenges emanating primarily from Russia and China, as they've made clear also in other contexts. And then finally, also there is the other Europeans beyond France. The European Union has been involved in the Sahel for some time in both training and security and defense capacity building missions. All missions that have been expanded or extended. And of course there are bilateral relations, and for instance Britain is increasing its involvement in the region and in support of the existing missions from a security defense point of view, but also in diplomatic terms by opening new embassies in the region. So there are many others who are involved, but I think these are the key actors. And I would say that although they all have different mandates, there's still issue of related to coordination. There is the risk of duplication of efforts, and also there are different levels of readiness and funding levels, and also I would say in some cases also professionalism as well.
Brilliant. I guess let's open the floor to questions. If you just start by mentioning your name and your affiliation, and then we'll take a few questions.
Yes, thank you. Jonathan Shaw, long-term British Army. Thank you, fascinating talk. It seems to me you focus very much on security architecture on there, with brief dips into the causes. And it seems to me that the security is only able to treat the symptoms. And the causes, it would seem to me, are, but tell me if I'm wrong, are climate change and demographic explosion, because sub-Saharan Africa, fastest growing populations in the world in 2050 or something. And that might just explain the localised upsurge of violence in little jihadist groups that all put their own name on, which means that it's not really jihadism that's driving it, this is a flag of convenience, a local power grab. I mean, tell me if this is wrong, but we've seen this in other countries, that this is what people do. They latch onto jihadism as a justification for their seizure of power and also their otherwise powerlessness. And that therefore security are never going to solve this problem. The way to manage it has to be, to go back to your dichotomy, is this about government or is this about military? No, it's about government stuff, it's about governance stuff. And in fact, just finished with a final story. When I was talking to the Chief of Defence Staff of Ethiopia 10 years ago, and I said to him, I'm surprised you don't have more counter-terrorism problems. And he said, we have a very good CT strategy. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's full employment. and you know, that's, I think, the point, that actually you're not going to solve this with security. We're putting a sticking plaster on a problem that's just going to get worse and worse over the next few years. And so I suppose the question was, how long do you think the international community is going to stay interested in this? Does it have an option to pull out, or must it take part? Because something's got to change, because this is going to get worse.
Hi, Lisa Warden, Foreign Office. I suppose my question is mainly based around the kind of different groups that you outlined. You mentioned how, unlike some other areas where there is kind of Islamic jihadist groups, sometimes they coordinate, sometimes they collaborate, and it's a lot less antagonistic. I was wondering about, we didn't touch on kind of organised crime groups, whether or not you could expand on kind of their presence,
Yes.
how do they facilitate that kind of coordination, and anything else about their role in conflict.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Michael Jones, I'm at Fitch. I know that Côte d'Ivoire has announced that they're sending an extra 650 troops to Mali. Now, given the kind of security aspect of this is expanding and increasingly affecting neighbouring countries, do you think there's any scope for an increased involvement by neighbouring West African countries in both the civil and military arena? And if so, do you think it will make any difference?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. Thank you very much. So, General Shaw's question. Thank you for bringing up demographic and climate. And I mean, we are focused primarily on security, but especially within our team, we go on and on about all these other things that compound insecurity, and conflict. Well, how long can the West stay engaged? Yes, I think, whilst on the one hand there is a certain fatigue, but on the other end, we are seeing the expansion into new countries, and this also ties in with the other question. And those countries, and I'll try in a way kind of to combine the two answers, actually reflect my broader concerns on how Burkina Faso in particular can be used as a springboard for Sahelian jihadists and other security challenges actually to move into coastal West Africa. We have already seen, of course, the Côte d'Ivoire development with the deployment of these new troops. We've also seen Togo and Benin deploying troops close to their northern borders to stem the influx into insecurity into their own countries. And actually, there was this incident you might have seen last month where four foreign tourists were kidnapped in northern Benin, then taken by criminals to Burkina with the aim of going into Mali and to actually sell them on to jihadi. Luckily, French foreign forces with US support managed to stop this from happening. But already you see an example of all this transnational dimension. So my concern is that countries such as Togo and Benin, but also we can talk, for instance, of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, are at risk of actually seeing these growing insecurity, jihadi insecurity within their own territory. And I think they are particularly vulnerable because they don't really have much experience with dealing with city challenges, which makes them very vulnerable. And even if you look at the Burkina Faso, of course, up until a few years ago, Burkina was never faced by any terrorism challenges. Actually, it's a country that was very proud to say that although they have a diverse Muslim, Christian population, people coexisted very peacefully. And now all of a sudden they are receiving end of these terrorist challenge. But they're not really learning from what they are experiencing, because since 2016, every single year there has been an attack in the capital, Ouagadougou. But the security forces don't seem to learn from this experience, and every time seem to be caught by surprise. So they don't give me much confidence that Burkina can actually act as a barrier from that jihadi spread moving into coastal West Africa. And coastal West Africa is where, I'd say, many Western, European especially, actors have commercial and business interests. So can these Western states afford not to pay attention? So that would be my answer to that. With regard to organized crime, yes, that's a whole different dimension that actually coalesces with a conflict and terrorism. I think Mali, and especially northern Mali, has often been used as a case study of illicit trafficking of all sorts of goods, from people, weapons, subsidized foodstuff, and of course narcotics, have actually been used to fuel the emergence and the enlargement of armed groups, and also to fuel conflict. And actually drug trafficking in particular, if we look at recent statistics, have actually led to unprecedented for the sub-region levels of violence in northern Mali. And also they've had an impact on the way tribal structures function, because this influx of narcotics money has actually created new political and economic elites. So that's certainly something that needs to be addressed. And again, I don't think the solution lies in security or law enforcement responses, but lies into funding jobs that are actually licit. And then the other point is to do with migration. Migration into Europe, and Niger is a key example of that. Niger, especially the city of Agadez, that has become a key hub for migrants trafficking into Libya, has received millions of euros from the EU and others to stem illegal trafficking. And Niger has also implemented new legislation against smuggling. What happened is that, yes, the market in Agadez has shrunk, but also around 6,000 people who were directly or indirectly involved in the illicit migration business have become unemployed. So they need to find alternative jobs. So are they going to become secretaries and doctors overnight? I don't think so. And plus, those migration routes, they're not disappear, they just moved. They are no longer true well-known routes. There are true more insecure routes across the desert, making it even more treacherous for migrants to get to northern Europe. So again, I don't think it's security, but it's development that would help with that.
Yeah, just wanted to. I think it was a very comprehensive answer, but just to add on what the Coastal Africa countries are doing. A few representatives have said in the past months that they didn't expect the spread into East and even Southwest Africa, Burkina Faso, to be so fast. So they were actually saying publicly that they were surprised by how fast it can go. And as Virginia said, they have deployed troops at the border, but they also started to cooperate more with Burkina Faso, and they've already organized joint patrols at the border. So that's for Coastal Africa, and I just wanted to talk a bit also about climate change, because we haven't mentioned it, and it's very good that you bring it up. I think it's particularly worrying to think about climate change in relation with communal violence, because it's already exploded now, but we know that temperatures are rising in the Sahara 1.5 times faster than anywhere else, that 80% of the land for agriculture is degraded already, 80% is degraded, that the land for pastoralists is also shrinking, and that food production is decreasing because of poor rainfall or long droughts. So, it's already an explosive relationship between those groups, and on top of that, the jihadist violence. But I think there's really everything for an explosive combination. So climate change, dependence on agriculture, chronic poverty, underdevelopment, and just like history of conflict. So very worrying times to come.
I might have to take the group and the ladies in
the cluster.
So, Nella, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, analyse. Virginia, I was fascinated about what you said about the relative coordination between Al-Qaeda aligned groups and Islamic State aligned groups, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think that relatively harmonious is maybe a bit stronger word, but cooperative relationship developed. Does that indicate a greater localization of the conflict than in some other areas where we've seen a more contentious relationship between aligned groups? Or is this to do with greater disengagement from ISIS in Syria and Iraq? I'd be very interested to hear a bit more about that.
The lady next to her.
I'm Megan with the Arts Research Group. My question is about the way the UK is choosing to engage. So I'm curious about whether you think that when the UK engage, both in Mali but also wider in the Sahel, whether they're doing so based on local demand signals, or are they doing so more as a way to send local signals to France that they are going to stay engaged, or to other partners in the country, in the region?
And the lady behind her.
Yeah, I guess I have a question that builds on that. I'm Emily Knowles, also from the Oxford Research Group. I had a question about incentives. I thought it was really interesting that Fleur mentioned the reliance and perhaps the over-reliance of countries in the region on international support, especially for security. And I thought it was really interesting. In a lot of our interviews, with French armed forces, for example, they mentioned that pressure to engage, especially like through Serval and Barkhane. There are some people now who are questioning whether it has relieved sort of all pressure on Bamako to actually reform or deal meaningfully with some of those causes and drivers of conflict to begin with, and to what extent that sent a message that the international community would not accept, under any circumstances, an expansion of jihadist violence in the region. So I guess my question there is around, is there anything that could have been done differently, or do you see that trajectory changing? Is the international community, because you named it, a huge number of actors who are active in the region, are they meaningfully kind of trying to adapt and incentivize local capitals, I suppose, to really address those fundamental questions, or has this all become about sort of firefighting and containing threats from terrorist groups?
And gentleman here.
Paul Laskowski, International SOS. Do you expect the jihadi groups to keep expanding their influence deeper into the interior of Mali and Burkina Faso in the coming months, perhaps staging more attacks on urban centers?
Brilliant. Would you like to go first?
I think the questions are more directed to Virginia, so.
Okay, sure. On Nella's point about coordination between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think there are multiple explanations for this, and I think your point on localization is one of them. I would say that although this is also something that we've seen elsewhere, but I think here in particular we see a continuation of those ties that are kind of family ties, or ties that are resulting from, for instance, Islamic State militants having been in prisons with other jihadists, having trained with, having learned from some of them. It's also, as you said, again, the issue of localization and the fact that the local knowledge, and the fact that it's quite hard for a new actor to find a space where Al-Qaeda is so prominent. So it's hard to find a space to operate without some sort of coordination with Al-Qaeda. And I think this also speaks to the fact that this is way more localized, the agendas are way more localized in the Sahel than you would see in other parts of the world. So there's broader theological rivalries between the two camps are less prominent in this part of the world. With regard to the UK choosing to engage, well, I think we haven't. It's only in recent times that we are hearing a more prominent role played by the UK in the region. However, the UK is not completely new to the region, and I remember being involved in some private conversations that were happening a long time ago around supporting the G5. No, not talking about the military side of it, which is relatively new, but also from a diplomatic and political perspective. So the UK has been involved. Of course, traditionally, this part of the world is more of a area of interest for France, of course, because it's a largely francophone region. But the UK is not completely new. What we are seeing is that older division between different spheres of interest between the francophone and the anglophone countries across West Africa, I think is becoming more blurred. Because if you look also at the responses to Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin, again, where the UK has traditionally played a more prominent role, France has also become more and more involved, hosting international conferences in Paris, and also providing support from its Nigerian bases to the operations taking place in the Lake Chad. So I think there is more cooperation on that front. And more broadly, I think there is an understanding that is important for the UK, I guess, to to expand its foothold in the region in order to understand better the region and being able to act more swiftly when things go wrong. I think the way that France acted so quickly in 2013 was made possible by the fact that it had pre-positioned troops, and it had a very deep knowledge of the region, and that helped a lot. Regarding incentives and what the international community could have done differently, okay, that's a very tricky, it's a challenging one. One thing that I find is that we are talking a lot about supporting the implementation of the Malian peace agreement, but I feel sometimes that we are talking about implementing a peace agreement for a conflict that no longer is. What we are implementing is now a different conflict, and I think these efforts sometimes haven't kept pace with the developments on the ground. Already when the Algiers peace agreement was in the making, I was wondering, yes, there are these two umbrella groups, the platform and the coalition, talking in Algiers, but actually most of the violence is perpetrated by jihadists. And those two platform and coordination, actually, they don't have power on those jihadists. So they could agree whatever they want in Algiers, but violence is going to continue in Mali. So I think all those different agendas have not been taken into account. And another agenda that I feel is not being taken account enough in terms of peace negotiations is the criminal agendas, going back to some of the questions that we heard earlier. And if we have learned from the experience of other peace agreements and other conflicts, FARC, Colombia, cocaine trade comes to mind. If you ignore those agendas, then you're missing a big piece of the puzzle, because when some of this group throws so much cash from criminal activities, it means that you cannot really put that much political pressure on them, because they already have all the cash they need. So I think those criminal agendas need to be to be paid attention more.
Yeah. Just to add to that, on the reliance on international actors and especially France, Jean-Yves Le Drian, I think earlier this month or maybe in May, openly criticized countries in the region for basically relying too much on Barkhane, and it's the first time he publicly criticized them. So he was quite harsh, saying that they should stop just relying on France and kind of hiding behind French forces, and that they need to really take the matters into their own hands, because France is not going to be there forever. So increased, I think, just frustration from the French in Mali, and it really seems like the more efforts they put, the worse it gets. I mean, since 2012, it's never been, the violence has never been that high, so we wonder, if, the UK increases their forces, or if other actors try to add another layer of security answers, what is really going to do. And the same for the MINUSMA, and coming back also to the frustration with the peace process. There's so much effort in the UN being put on this, on the implementation of this peace agreement in terms of DDR programs or constitutional reforms. And we see that the US, also because of the Trump administration, but also because there's almost no progress being made on that side. And they agreed now on the renewal of the mandate of the MINUSMA. They're going to vote at the Security Council on Thursday, so 27th of June. And the mandate is probably going to be renewed, but they have already agreed to rediscuss the mandate. So we're probably going to see less deployment, or a mandate that is even smaller than what is now. So increased frustration for sure on parts of almost all international actors.
Okay. Last few questions, Ben.
There's quite a few armed actors here on the blue side as opposed to the red or the black side. Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I counted Mali and the fellow G5 states, MINUSMA, France, the EU, and the US. Do you have any sense of how the Friends of Mali are coordinating themselves?
Hello, so just Ewan Smith from the Foreign Office UN Department. Flore, you mentioned the closure of MINUSMA eventually, and I was wondering, obviously they'll have a reduction in troop numbers, but what sort of mission or presence in country do you think the UN needs to have in order to try and manage the risk of that transition of security responsibility to the Mali and our G5 forces? And then just looking at your map on the region, I was really struck by the extent to which actually this is a regional problem, not one dictated by country strategies, and what role or increased role potentially should UNOWAS have in bringing together peace building, preventive diplomacy, any kind of mediation efforts across the region.
Any more questions? Just those two.
Yeah, so just for the MINUSMA, so I don't remember now the numbers on top of my head, but I think one of the big issues with the MINUSMA now, outside of how many they are and what kind of mandate they have, and the same goes for French forces, is that they're still quite heavily present in the north of Mali, where sure there's still some fightings, but that's not where the most violence is taking place. I think in MINUSMA they have 600 a deployment of 600. If we go back to, can you go back to the last slide? Just the last one. Yeah, this one. So they have 600 people in Kidal, which, again, I'm not saying they're not doing anything, but that's not where most of the action is taking place. So just by redeploying to places where basically Mopti region and Ségou region, which is a bit basically around here, instead of being up there, would already harm quite a lot. And the same with the French now. They just opened new military bases in the Gourma region, which is really this region at the border between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. So I think, outside of more forces, mandate, coordination, etc., there just need to be really a reorganization of where the forces are, and actually deploy where it matters. Especially now with communal violence, they're not where they should be.
Yes, on Ben's point on coordination. Of course, there is some coordination, of course, happening, and you can see also how some of these missions are co-located in Bamako, for instance, and elsewhere. And also there is a certain, of course, the division of labors that avoid too much overlap. But I find that coordination, especially when it comes to the G5 Sahel force, that although it is one force, it consists of five different contingents, and I find that the communication with those contingents is not always as smooth as it should be, and it also ties in with pre-existing tensions among some of those countries. So I think there is some coordination, but it could certainly be strengthened.
Brilliant. I'm going to leave it there because there's so many more questions we could ask on China, on governance issues and whatnot. Just want to thank Fleur and Virginia both for their insightful analysis on the conflict, and thank you, the audience, for your engaging questions as well. That brings us to the end of this session, and please stay tuned for more of our conflict briefings and other events that we have come up as well. Thank you very much.